Thank you. Thank you so much. I can feel the connection in the energy of that song, which is just fabulous. So I remember one of the most amazing spiritual experiences that I have ever had in my own life. I was in my early to mid 40s, and I'd been dabbling a bit in Reiki. In fact, I was just finishing a training session where there was sort of this symbolism of opening my crown chakra as I was receiving spiritual symbols to help me with work that I was doing in energy healing and hands-on healing work. And while the training itself and the ceremony was powerful, that wasn't the most amazing part. What happened is right afterwards, there were a group of us and people started to hug each other and congratulate each other, and somebody I didn't know came up to me. And they gave me a hug and they whispered in my ear and they said, "I love you." And the most amazing thing happened. It's like the words didn't go in my ear. The words like funneled up and went into my crown chakra and came all the way through my body. And I felt like I was transported to another place. And I know that in real time, this was only like maybe 3 to 5 seconds of this experience, and yet I felt like it was 5 minutes. And I entered this place of what I called timeless love, because I just had this overwhelming sense of love like I had never experienced in my life at that time or even since. And so I look at that experience and realizing that place of love, I was in that shift of energy for maybe 3 days. I was so overcome by the feelings of love in that moment that I cried on and off for over an hour. The people that were in this group with me were aware that I had experienced something really, really profound, and that I could do nothing but cry and just appreciate the level of love that I experienced. And then after about 3 days, the energy started to lower, and then after about 7, I was kind of back to my normal self. And I was like, darn, how could I get that space back again? I tell that story because today I'm continuing my series on the human condition, and a very big important part of our journey is obviously our spirituality, and that shows up in many different ways. I'm going to be talking about both stages of faith today and also states of consciousness, and I believe what I experienced with that story was a state of consciousness. So I've been talking, this is the 3rd week of this series, and Aaron, if you could give me the next slide, it's a little bit of a review of where we've been. It's showing that I started with we need to grow up as human beings. We need to grow up physically. We need to, our next one is clean up emotionally. We did that a couple weeks ago. And then today we're talking about waking up spiritually. And all of this work is so that we can show up in the world and bring our best Christ self forward to the world. So I also want to share, as we begin this conversation about spirituality, I almost feel like we need to talk about what I'm not talking about, and that is these terms that people seem to go to in our culture, which is religion and dogma. So I wanted to share with you, I'm not talking about religion today, although that might be part of your individual journey. Religion is a particular system of faith and worship. That's actually a definition from Webster. And also dogma is principles set down by authority and considered to be absolute truth. So those are areas of religion. I'm not talking about that today. What I do want to talk about is spirituality. And in my research for this topic today, I found all kinds of definitions of what exactly this is, and I picked like my best 3 of what I wanted to focus on. The first one is that I really believe that spirituality is a unique path for each individual person. I even believe that there could potentially be as many religions as the world as there are people. It just happens to be that at certain periods of time, people with like-minded thinking have come together and created a group of people that they wanted to be together with, which is how our churches and religions got formed. The second one is a willingness to explore the possibility of a power greater than oneself, and you can even call that God or spirit, or you could call it something else. And the third one is an inner path enabling one to discover the essence of his or her being. That one's the one that most rings true to me. It's this ability to self-reflect and question and listen within. And I often hear people today, especially our young people, talking about, well, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. I think it's important for us to understand the distinction, because we need to know what people are talking about. Now, in this series, we've also been talking about this book, The Human Condition by Thomas Keating, which I adore. And, he says that we spend the first half of our life asking the question, where are you? Where am I in relation to God, myself, and others? And we've been talking about that in this series. But what happens is then out of that question, many people in our first half of life, we're developing that ego structure, and we start to look for happiness in the wrong places. These places, like security and survival, affection and esteem, and power and control. So you might listen into yourself and see if those are the places that you're looking in your own journey. And I can tell you it's part of the human journey, but it's a bit misguided. So see if you can figure out a way to redirect to where you really want to go. In Thomas Keating's book, The Human Condition, he says this is the journey of the false self. He says the false self is looking for fame, power, wealth, and prestige. The unconscious is very powerful until the divine light of the Holy Spirit penetrates to its depths and reveals its dynamics. Here is where the great teaching of the dark nights of St. John of the Cross correspond to depth psychology. Only the work of the Holy Spirit goes far deeper. Instead of trying to free us from what interferes with our ordinary human life, the Spirit calls us to transformation of our innermost being, and indeed of all of our faculties, into the divine way of being and acting. And that divine way of being and acting is what he calls the true self. And in Unity, we also call it individuality. I'm amazed at how similar these two books are, despite the fact that they come from different faith traditions. This is Emily Cady's Lessons in Truth, and it's a primer in Unity. And then this is The Human Condition from Thomas Keating. So I want to share a little bit about the similarities in terms of Emily Cady. This is the false self, true self from Keating. And in Unity, it's personality, individuality. And here's what she says about individuality. She says, the more God comes into visibility through a person, the more individualized he becomes, he or she. We cultivate individuality by listening to the still small voice down deep within us and boldly following it, even if it does make us different from others, as it surely will. And then she continues, individuality in another not only produces in you an admiration for its superiority, but it also gives you, when you are in its presence, a strange new sense of your own inherent possibilities, a sense that is full of exhilaration and comfort and encouragement to you. So it's no wonder in my own life, and especially my very long journey with Unity, I was always seeking out Unity ministers and other spiritual teachers, people like Reverend Mary Umwake and Reverend Patricia Bass and Reverend Robert Brummett and even Sharif Abdullah, who I think some of you have done some training with here. People that I have seen this individuality that they just exhibit in their lives. And just by being in their presence, I was recognizing that I could learn from them and cultivate that within myself. Now, for those of you who are into metaphysics, I do want to share that there are characters in the Bible that are connected to these, that represent these qualities. And John the Baptist is basically the illumined intellect. He's like the highest development of human consciousness, which is an aspect of the human personality. And then obviously Jesus is the example of individuality. So in the second half of life, the question is, who are you? So I want to return to Thomas Keating once again. And he says, we spend the first part of our lives finding a role, becoming a mother, a father, a professor, a doctor, a minister, a soldier, a business person, an artisan, or whatever. The paradox is that we can never fully fulfill our role until we are ready to let it go. Whoever we think we are not. We have to find that out, and the best way to do so, or at least the most painless way, is through the process that we call the spiritual journey. This requires facing the dark side of our personality and the emotional investment we have made in false programs for happiness and in our particular cultural conditioning. Now, Keating recommends The most gentle way of finding and dealing with these false programs that he's talking about is a form of meditation that is called centering prayer. He says centering prayer is not an end in and of itself, but its deep rest loosens up the emotional weeds of a lifetime. He continues that when our defenses go down, up comes that dark side of our personality so that we can actually see it. And to see it is that first step of integration and moving forward. So over the years in Unity, I have heard so many stories from different people. And have you ever heard somebody say something like, well, I got hit by a 2x4, and this experience was just, just rocked my world in some way? Has anybody ever heard that besides me? Yeah, there's a few people saying yeah. Well, Keating says that these type of experience, he calls them humiliations, which is certainly the more difficult way to get in touch with the true self. So when people tell me these kinds of stories, I always ask questions because I want to make sure that they're in touch with maybe what they learned out of that experience. So I'm always saying, what did you learn about yourself as a result of that experience? And were you able to go deeper with yourself after that experience? Because ultimately, that's what it's all about. Now, humiliations, I had to find the little embarrassed emoji. Isn't that cute? Don't see that too often. I'm not sure that one's on my phone. But this is probably the most powerful quote from Thomas Keating's book. He's talking about humiliations. The spiritual journey is not a career or success story. It is a series of humiliations of the false self that become more and more profound. These make room inside us for the Holy Spirit to come in and heal. What prevents us from being available to God is gradually evacuated. We keep getting closer and closer to our center. Every now and then, God lifts a corner of that veil and enters into our awareness through various channels as if to say, here I am. Where are you? Come and join me. Now, after reading this, I had to start thinking about some of my own humiliating experiences. I'm like, oh my goodness, do I really have to go there? So don't want to share all this publicly, So we all have lessons to learn, no doubt. And yet I did find, one area that I was willing to share. In my early 20s, I was a Cub television news reporter. And it was a very visible learning curve. So anything that we did was shown in front of all kinds of different people. And I had my moments where I made some mistakes, and it was very deeply embarrassing to me, and yet I learned how to deal with it. One of the most important things that I learned about myself as a result of those experiences is that I had to move on from what other people thought of me. What was most important was that what I had, what do I think of myself? That's a really powerful lesson to learn when you're in your 20s. So I celebrate that today. Now, Thomas Keating encouraged each of us to be brave enough to do the work that we need to do. And he notes that the bottom of the spiritual journey is also the top. So keep that in mind. If you're in one of those spaces where one of those humiliations is showing up in your life, it's a huge learning point for you, and you're going back to the top. Another very important part of the spiritual journey and spiritual awakening that I want to talk about is about stages of faith. If you remembered a few weeks ago, I was talking about developmental lines that we go through in life and their stages. We start at one stage and we move to the next, and we bring those stages with us. It's like we don't go back down them. It's part of our own growth process. So James Fowler was one of the researchers in this area, and he actually wrote a book called Stages of Faith. And the question that he was researching is, what is of ultimate concern? And he interviewed all kinds of different people, did all kinds of studies for years, and came up with really powerful information. Now, this information is a little bit in the intellect, and I'm not going to share much of it, but I want to share some of the stages and focus on a few key ones, because many of us are in these stages right now, and it's helpful to see where we're at, just to appreciate it, and to maybe see what the next step is and where we're going. So the very first one is, there's a couple ones when we're very young. Stage 1, intuitive projective faith, which is a child ages like 3 to 7. This is fantasy-filled and about imitation. Stage 2 is mythic literal faith. This could be a grade school child, and a child takes on stories, beliefs, and observances that symbolize belonging to the community. Again, the community is the key component there, because when we're kids, we need to feel like we fit in. This is a big one. Stage 3, which is adolescence and adult. Okay, so this is a conformist stage, where one is acutely tuned to the expectations and judgments of significant others, and as of yet does not have a sure enough grasp on its own identity and autonomous judgment to construct and maintain an independent perspective. So I call this stage the brainwashing stage. So many of us have been programmed in other faiths and other situations, and we're just kind of taking on what everybody else is telling us. And for some people, that's okay. I'll let you know that. And they may stay at this stage 3 faith their entire life. That has certainly not been my path. I've always been a person that's asking questions. And when we start asking questions and are reflecting and are trying to figure out individually what's right for me, that's possibly the place that we would move on to. I did want to share one more thing to give you a better sense of the conformist stage 3. One of the things I like about this book is that there are a lot of interviews and examples from people in real life. And this gives you an example. The interviewer says, what does it mean? They were interviewing Linda. What does it mean when you say you are going to go to heaven? She said, well, nobody really knows. It's supposed to be paradise. And I guess I'll find out sometime. But see, I don't want to ask too many questions like that. I always want to, well, lots of people have really done research on religion, and, they've gone kind of insane, I've never really wanted to go that much into it. I just wanted to do what the Bible says. Lots of people think how the earth started and everything. There's a limit for me. I know that it started with God. God made it, and I don't ask any more questions, I think I'll find out later. So you can clearly hear where that stage 3 place is, and you may be able to identify people in your own life, in your own world, that are at this stage 3 place, which is fine. I'm not trying to create any judgment about this. I'm just trying to show this is where people potentially could be. So asking questions, I think, is the step that moves people on to stage 4, and I'll let you know that I think the majority of people in Unity are at stage 4th faith. This is young adulthood or later, early 30s or 40s. There's critical distancing from one's previous assumptive value system. Now, that does not necessarily mean it's a different church or religion. It could be that maybe somebody was atheist and they had an awakening and now they're a seeking spirit. Relocation of the authority within the self, critical reflection, self-fulfillment, or self-actualization has become a primary concern. So you might listen into yourself and see if you feel like you fit into that category. And so many people question, when they come to me, they're looking for ways that they can grow, and I always point to the direction of doing shadow work, because you might be surprised to find out that that's the next step in development. When people start doing shadow work and become more willing to look at that darker side that we talked about, and bring that forward and integrate it, they're well on their way to stage 5 faith. This is usually unusual before midlife. These people see many sides of an issue simultaneously. They come to terms with the unconscious. They're open to interfaith conversation that makes one vulnerable to the other's truth. I'll stop there for a minute. So it's not just about, okay, I'm going to listen to what somebody else has to say, but I'm not really going to be in real conversation with them. It's just them, and I'm here, and we're separate. At this stage, people are really genuinely interested in hearing someone else's perspective in their life and how spirit is moving. And in hearing that, maybe I'll be open and more vulnerable to that. There's a new reclaiming and reworking of one's past. There's a commitment to justice that is freed from the confines of tribe, class, religion, a religious community, or nation. So if somebody's doing something with social justice in this area, it's not connected to their culture. It's internal. It's what they feel is right that needs to be done in the world. So another area that James Fowler shared was an interview that he did with a 78-year-old lady. Her name is Miss T. And I'll share a little bit about her background. She was brought up Unitarian, which is not Unity, by the way. And she did find the Quakers, so she was in that organization for a while. She said that her religion became a search for beauty. She said, I think I've always been a religious person, but I had to stop calling myself a churchgoer. I didn't go to church for years and years and years, except to please my mother at Christmas and Easter. But then she said, It continues, she had a delayed midlife crisis. She found Carl Jung's depth psychology, which is shadow work. And she also found an Indian sage, Krishnamurti, who became one of her teachers. And so the interviewer asked her, well, what did you learn from this Indian sage? What was impact on that was on your life? And she says that it doesn't matter what you call it, whether you call it God or Jesus or cosmic flow or reality or love, it doesn't matter what you call it. It is there. And what you learn directly from that source will not tie you up in creeds or dogma, I would add in, that separate you from your fellow man. So she was pointing out that the journey is all about connecting with spirit and other people, not about any form of separation. Then the next stage is the last one. This is universalizing faith, which is very rare. Actualizers of the spirit of an inclusive and fulfilled human community. They're contagious in the sense that they create zones of liberation from the social, political, economic, and ideological shackles we place and endure on human futurity. So examples of this are like Gandhi, and in later years, Martin Luther King Jr. What's sad about this category is that many times people at this stage are so well advanced that they threaten other people at lower levels, and so the people at the lower levels also kill those leaders. Many people have died because of this. Now, so I want to remind you that the stages, they stack on top of each other, so once you go to a next stage, you don't go back. Okay, you bring what with you to the next stage. A big part of the spiritual journey for some people is what is called the dark night of the soul, and I call it big, not because they live in that space for a long time, but because there was some kind of change that came out of that was so impactful and significant in their life. It's my interpretation and looking at my own life that I believe these dark night of the soul moments occur when we're moving from one stage to the next. I remember there's a dismantling process that goes on when we leave a stage. It's like what we're familiar with is not working anymore. I'm not satisfied. I'm not being fed. There's just something that's not right. That's the divine calling of spirit saying it's time to grow and it's time to move and learn something new. And sometimes that stage takes a while, and so people enter the space of the dark night when they feel like they're all alone. So in addition to stages of consciousness, I want to talk about states of consciousness. I won't speak very much about this, but I want you to know they exist. The three main categories are gross waking, which is being physical. We can, we're here, we're moving around. You can ride a bike, I can give this talk. There's subtle dream, which is about literal dreaming at night when you're sleeping. You can daydream, you can do visualization, and probably beginning levels of meditation are at this space. And then also there's causal formless, which is a deep dreamless sleep. There's formless meditation, what I would probably call the deeper level of meditation, contemplative meditation, and even experiences of emptiness. And then experts also say there's a fourth, non-dual awareness, which is really hard for me to describe. It basically is saying there's an ever-present ground of all states that exists in these state categories. We also have peak and religious experiences and altered states. And I would say, my story of timeless love, that fit into one of these categories. What's so important to recognize the difference between stages and states is that states are available to all people at all times, even babies, because we all can be awake, we can all dream, and we can all sleep. These can come and go at any single time, just like a weather storm in the middle of the summer. And there's like 75% of the population that have said that they have had an altered state experience in their life. I debated on if I wanted to include this little chart. It seems a little bit intellectual, and yet there's something profound that's shared in this. It's called the Wilbur-Combs lattice, basically named after the philosophers that created it. This is showing how the stages go up this side, so they go up, and the states are across the top, the four that I mentioned. So the same person can be in the same situation, but have a different experience, a different spiritual experience. That's what this chart is mapping. And I think it's just really profound to understand that we all don't have to be in the same place at the same time. So our answer, always in this process of growth is around centering prayer. So whether you're reading Thomas Keating or Emily Cady or material from numerous other religious traditions that point to the same direction that I'm talking about, the answer for living a life and dealing with challenges of the human condition is prayer and meditation. And Keating spent decades advocating and teaching centering prayer. He says, the spiritual is not immediately evident to ordinary consciousness. We have to do something to develop our awareness of it. We have to tap into it, folks. It is the level of our being that makes us most human. So he says that daily practice of meditation, refreshes our body and our soul, and it should be no different than any other thing that we do in our life. The basic necessities of exercise and food and rest and sleep. So after the potluck today, I'll be doing a beginning centering prayer class. We'll only spend about 10 minutes of reading and kind of figuring out some basic information, and then I'm going to do 3 different short periods of centering prayer in different ways, subtle different ways, so you can see maybe what might work best for you. Again, I'll remind you that studies are showing right now that if you spend as little as 20 minutes a day in meditation, in that quiet space, that you will move through these stages of faith that I was talking about in a much more efficient manner, connecting with yourself, bringing your true self forward. And maybe that's not the most important thing, speed, but perhaps it's grace. The fact that maybe you won't have to have the 2x4 experience, the fact that you're connected to yourself and that you're listening to yourself so you can move through that with grace. One final thing that I want to mention is that as we continue to grow spiritually, it really shows up in our life in terms of our choices and what we're doing. And I found some information from somebody online named Scott Jeffrey, who was really recognizing these areas of change that show up when we're spiritually going. So as I finish up, I'll go through these very quickly. It's like a countdown. And Aaron, if you can help me with this, I'll start with number 10. Listen into yourself. So if you're not connecting with one of these, maybe that's a place for you to look to grow. Number 10, your behavior spontaneously changes for the better. Number 9, you experience a deepening of emotional connection and well-being. Number 8, you are slowing down and reflecting on your past to understand your present. Number 7, your priorities and values are shifting from the material to the spiritual. Number 6, your inner world is becoming a primary aspect of your life experience. Number 5, you're beginning to hold the tension of opposites together within yourself. Number 4, you're experiencing a growing sense of okayness and inner freedom. Number 3, you're willing to be honest with yourself and take personal responsibility. Number 2, you're making your new lifestyle decisions in alignment with your moral and spiritual values. And number 1, you're realizing that your interconnected nature resides with all things. So there's a huge feeling of connection within yourself and within the world. So with that, I really am encouraging you to be open to whatever is your own next step in spiritual awakening. Maybe it's some study work, maybe it's prayer. And I hope that many of you will join me after the potluck today for a lesson in centering prayer. Namaste.